Hi everyone, in this part we're going to talk about what effective action actually looks like. So moving beyond just thinking about what activities people often engage in related to environmental action, to thinking about the tension that is often kind of constructed around whether that action should be in the form of an individual act, for example, of ethical maybe consumption, or whether and how we need to construct pathways for systematic approaches that address these problems on a larger scale. And particularly within this debate, those questions of the extent to which we have human agency always come up. So is our human agency limited to small individual actions, or is our individual agency tied to a greater collective that we can develop and expand to create larger change, like political change? And importantly, within this video, we will also explore the debate about whether we, as a general term, should be more focused on both individual change, or if we should be engaging in one but not both for now, whilst we're still kind of figuring out the best way to address environmental and social issues and the best solutions like technology and systems changes, because we're still kind of figuring this out. We don't know exactly what the best thing to do is in all these cases. I like a quote that I heard a while ago in actually that seminar video that I included in one of the tutorials that I was at. One of the ladies on the panel said something like that this is a long-term problem, not a short-term, and we need long-term methods and solutions, but we only have a short time to figure it out. And that's a really hard place to be. And we've talked about that in class, at least I have with the Sydney class, that we kind of need to do this in a balanced way. Whilst this is urgent, it would be ideal to try to change things properly whilst we are changing things. Now, I'm sure you can even feel it at times that there's a lot of tension between individual versus structural solutions to issues like climate change and in other environmental justice issues as well. And indeed, the scholarship in social justice is filled with debates about this, not only in relation to environmental issues, but other issues such as the global poverty and the role of charity, the role of gender inequality, and so on. And what is the role of individuals, and what is the role of the structural and systematic change as well? So these are really difficult questions to answer, like when is the individual action more impactful, and when do we need to focus on the structures? In every case, how responsible are the individuals and how responsible are the systems? And again, kind of going broader, how does this relate to other environmental and social issues like gender inequality, racism and exploitation, and just so much more? Before we dive any deeper though, let's first talk about what is meant when we refer to individual versus structural change, starting with individual change. Individual change is often referring to the acts that individuals can incorporate into their lives more so on a daily basis. So to understand this in the context of climate issues, we're going to use the example of ethical consumption. So individual acts of ethical consumption could include consuming foods with less of a carbon footprint or chemical use, consuming animal products that have been more ethically sourced, or reduce how much meat we eat in a week through the simple change of making your lunches, vegetarian or something, or even buying enough food to reduce your waste. Or if we think of consumption and fashion, maybe combating modern slavery through becoming educated about fast fashion companies, and of course then not buying from those companies. And it could also take the form of supporting groups that are engaged in activism or who are more affected by climate injustice. So for example, one might donate to countries or communities that have been adversely affected by climate change, or you might volunteer or donate to some organization that's, working towards solutions. All of these are all individual acts that we can take on a daily basis, or at least frequently, kind of engaging with them like they're a habit. So it doesn't need to be something that we necessarily have to do every day, at least I think. It can kind of be part of our schedule and something that we commit to and we show up to, at least on a regular basis. Then there are structural systematic change. That is more collective forms of action that seek to change institutional and state policies, for example. So policies around maybe gas and oil production, or it might be changing state or international domestic laws. It might be creating treaties or agreements between different countries, or creating independent bodies that oversee environmental justice issues and kind of keep corporations in check. And often there is that tension we've been talking about around this. So recently there has been a lot of criticism of the historical focus on individual change, and even in class we have explored this, particularly in the context of climate change. You can see here in this article by The Conversation that was published in 2019, and certainly there's a lot more literature now that's been published on this topic, but essentially the argument is that individuals have been kind of sold this lie that individual change, for example, through ethical consumption and reducing carbon footprint, is enough to solve the problem of climate change and is indeed all we can hope for, and that this is what we should be focusing on. A big part of this argument is that by focusing on our responsibilities as individuals, placing a sense of guilt and panic upon the individual consumer is really suggesting that they are responsible for the carbon emission. They are responsible for the underpaid or unpaid labor that's making this product, which is not inherently true, as most items are produced at a much wider, more structural level. But again, all of this kind of pressure and responsibility is being put on the individuals. And it's individuals who then feel this guilt and internal blame about causing the problems, who seek to change it through small actions. But this does, in many ways, kind of rob people, meaning us as well, of our political will to demand change for the system, from our leaders, from our institutions, and from our corporations. We kind of take the burden onto ourselves as individuals, and this depoliticalizes the issue of climate change. And you can see some of the critiques around individual change reflected in this meme that's on the slide, and other memes as well, which have been written about some scholars who've talked about the kind of dichotomy set up between structural change and structural problems, and individual changes and individual choices, and argues that individual choice, ethical consumption, reducing our carbon footprint have such minuscule contributions to the overall problem of climate change and environmental damage more broadly, that focusing on individuals is absolutely a red herring. So it is distracting us as well from the bigger problems and from demanding change from biggest polluters in these industries. So for example, a recent study showed that it is only 100 companies that are responsible for 71% of carbon emissions since 1988, and that half of these global emissions are produced by just 25 companies. So by diffusing this responsibility onto individual consumers, we're ignoring the much greater role that can be played, for example, by stricter regulations or legal actions that are required in respect of these really big polluters. Many others also point out that ethical consumption, whilst it seems like a really great idea, and actually is, of course, a really great idea, it's very difficult to achieve in the current context. That is, when the system is rigged up to be unethical, it's then really hard to be an ethical consumer. So when the policies and laws that govern ethics aren't in place, it gives individuals, consumers, very little actual choice to be able to choose ethically. So people have, for example, become aware about the issues of consuming beef and beef products because of their understanding of animal justice and the environment, and so choose maybe soy-based products, only to find out that those soybeans were produced by a company that continued to engage in deforestation so that they could farm more soybeans as the demand increased. Like we've said at the beginning, it's really hard to know what the best thing to do is sometimes, and that is because we are not really set up to be able to make the best decisions or know what the best decision is. And so the argument is that by focusing on individuals and assuming that they are the answer, we ignore the fact that individuals are operating within a very complex and unequal system that sets up very limited choice for human agency. And we see this, for example, in the fashion industry, where the injustices that are experienced in the fashion industry at structural levels, so impact all other aspects of the system, from the growth of the cotton or wool to where it's bleached and dyed to where it's woven to where it's then shipped and sold. At every part of the supply chain, there is a structural injustice ingrained into that system. And that makes it really difficult for individuals to be able to make ethical choices because there are so many points at which the system might be involving unethical practices. So often they also don't make this very transparent, so it is really hard to know if the whole process was ethical. So this normalized kind of background complex web of social and economic relations between geographically dispersed actors and individual consumers can easily become really overwhelming because it is a struggle to understand their role either in perpetuating injustice or making it better. Concerned with the ethical consumption narrative is the way in which it also masks the unequal burden of ethical consumption practices. For instance, research shows that women have historically played a far more significant role and have been assumed to play a far more significant role in promoting and practicing ethical consumerism, often because the kinds of industries that are focused on in regards to ethical consumption practices are industries that women and women's consumption practices are more associated with. So, for example, fast fashion, the makeup industry, and so on. Whereas industries and practices that are often more associated with men, so including maybe particular industries that men are more likely to work in day to day, are often not centered in these discussions about ethical consumption. So, for example, we don't really hear about ethical consumption practices in construction industries, which are responsible for huge amounts of waste every year, and as many issues around, there are many issues around supply and ethical consumption in that area as well. But we don't often hear that spoken about. We instead focus on other things like fast fashion and cosmetics. So there are all of these elements really. And again, depending on the product or the industry type, ethical consumption is not necessarily within reach for someone. So while in some cases of ethical consumption practices, they can be really affordable or even more affordable than the non-ethical consumption practice, at the most basic level, consuming less non-essential goods is actually a very cost-effective as well as environmental effective practice, because many of the goods that are producing tremendous harm to the earth are actually non-essential items anyway. But then there are those kinds of products that are essential for living, and accessing ethically made products is not always affordable for everyone, or might not geographically or practically be accessible to them for a wide variety of reasons. So, for example, time, maybe poorer single parent needing to buy more just conventional foods, which come with more plastic packaging and a greater carbon footprint. And then, of course, the fact that a focus on ethical consumption practices lays all the burden at the feet of individuals, often individuals without the same level of power as these big polluters, and kind of doesn't address the fact that those with the most power are having very little, if anything, to do with the responsibility of goods and services that they produce. Now, there are certainly a range of valid and widely discussed criticisms of focusing on individual agency and individual consumption practices, particularly for the way in which they deprive issues of climate change of their political nature or important acts to suppress or distract people from the much needed political action that is required. At the same time, authors like Brownstein and others have argued that we should not set up a false binary between individual and structural actions, and that they are seeing this binary being set up in social media, in scholarship, in a range of debates around environmental justice and climate change issues, that assumes that we should choose either between individual actions, which is kind of seen as the inferior option now, or structural actions, which is seen as now a superior thing to focus on. Instead, they argue that we should move beyond some of these false assumptions around this binary and think about the way in which individual action and structural change can be symbiotic if done in a particular way. So they look at this binary as part of a greater set of debates within the social sciences. For example, the false binary that is often set between human agency and structure, and argue that, as with the question of human agency and social structure, we have come to realize that there's quite a complex dialectic relationship between human individual agency and social structure. And this seems like a bit of a duh, I suppose, but try to recognize the impact of this not being clearly stated and included in discourse, and now it's quite impactful for at least our research as well. So structure certainly influences and shapes agency, but human agency can also influence structures. We have seen this time and time again. In some cases, the structure has changed first, but in most cases, people change in ways that, perhaps now they demand for more attention to this, this as an issue, which then influences and informs the structural change. We should bring this kind of understanding of structure and agency into the debates about individual or structural change for the climate. So how can we conduct research that considers the complex movements of people and structures to implement it so both are kind of changing with each other? Take, for example, Brownstein's and colleagues' outline of the different arguments from a structural perspective or an individualistic perspective on the issues of causal significance of individual action. So those who are in the structuralist camp, those, for example, who believe that structural and systematic change is the only true way that we can affect change on the environment, would argue that individual consumption choices don't actually mean very much. They don't actually really make a difference. Individualists, however, are those who focus very much on the positive role of individuals and how that role can play into social change. They would more so say that, well, actually, if you look at structures and governments and corporations and so on, they are very set in their ways. They're not kind of encouraged. They don't really want to change. They're not going to change just because we ask them to as well. They're rather set in their structures. And the only way we can have any sort of influence, given that those structures and those institutions are so set in their ways, is if we engage in individual change. So it's more so up to us, because those big corporations are simply not going to do anything on their own accord. Now, Brownstein and his team will argue that both of these sides make good points, but they set up a false binary because often it's a combination of both. So how do structural reforms actually happen? How does a change in policy happen? How do changes in law happen? Often they start from a collection or a collective of individuals who act. So whether it be a journalist taking up a particular issue and reporting on an issue in the media until there's enough kind of upset for it to be considered and inquired. Then the action moves perhaps onto those who make the inquiry about the issue, moving to those who can then come forward with their stories and lobby for the change, making the issue more visible on the streets, to those who are involved in and bring a social justice lens to the policy making process, and those who are in government. So ultimately, all structural changes are made up of a series of individual actions and choices, and so we need to get individuals on board in order to make a structural change. At the same time, individual agency is further enhanced by structural support. So for example, if individuals are given options within the system to consume more ethically, it will naturally enhance their capacity to act as individuals, to inspire more change. Again, Brownstein and their team argue that we need to think more complexly about the relationship between structural elements and individual choices. Individual choices can have some bearing on structural reform when industries realize that consumers want something different. Similarly, structural reforms can enhance the capacity for individual consumption to be more ethical. So perhaps better questions to ask now, considering all we know, are how are individual and structural factors interdependent and complex but also complementary? What ways or why do we actually need both in some cases? So the symbiotic thinking about the symbiotic relationships between people and structural action is a really useful way of thinking about this problem. Symbiotic thinking could really help to facilitate more positive social change and climate action by identifying the roles for individuals based on their positions within social structures. So it's not assuming that it's all up to the individual to affect change, but different individuals are placed differently within the social structure and within their roles can create change. Some might have their individual agency extend to policy analysis or the drafting of policy, whilst other individuals might have social agency in respect to protest action, for action, but maybe limited social agency in ethical consumption due to their financial or their geographical situation. So whatever it might be, everyone's positioned differently within the social structure, so we can work on identifying the roles that individuals already play and so could play in terms of some change. It would of course be important to find out empirically how these different actions affect change, so we can kind of focus on what the most effective individual forms of actions are that can affect then structural change. It is almost like a call to recognize the diversity of roles that individuals can play, but also to empirically examine what would benefit action, as we could understand which of the different cases of change were the most effective, rather than kind of getting stuck in that either or argument that we have explored already in this lecture. That is all for this video. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to do your work before the tutorials for this week.